Aloha, welcome to the first interview of the new Oceania literary series featuring Barbara Jane Reyes, January 22nd, 2015. I'm Craig Santos Perez. I'm the director of the creative writing program, and I'm joined by two interviewers. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Mayana Minahal.
I'm Amalia Bueno.
And we're all going to team up and ask Barbara some questions about her poetry, process, performance, some of her older work, as well as some of her new projects. So my first question is kind of a very general one.
Okay.
Tell us how you got started in poetry.
I feel like I've been writing stories my entire life. When they say that, I don't know, I mean, if you're an avid reader, that doesn't necessarily make you a writer, but I just feel like I've been writing my whole life. I don't know that I called it poetry, but I knew that it was musical and that it was full of like imagery and emotion. So I guess as a young person, I figured that's what poetry was. But it didn't necessarily resemble anything that I was reading in school. I think even today I'm still kind of, not necessarily struggling, but kind of still going over what qualifies written work as poetry. That's still a question I'm asking myself every time I put something down on the page. But yeah, ever since I was very young, I just always had a notebook full of words.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I noticed that in your writing you talk about location a lot and place. I know that you were born outside of this country and that you've moved, and the relationship to place and home is very complex. So I was wondering if you would just talk about place and what that means to you, and in your poetry, in your writing.
Yeah, okay. It is a little complicated, but I feel like it shouldn't be. I've lived in the Bay Area for most of my life, and I very much call that home. But as we know, as immigrants or children of immigrants, that relationship is constantly questioned, right? Where are you really from is something we're constantly asked, and after a while, it really started to make me think, what they're really asking is, or what they're really saying is, you don't belong here, you're not from here, you could never be part of this, right? And so that's something that I've been carrying like a big chip on my shoulder, and something that I've been carrying with me through my work. Does writing poetry about that relationship help unravel the relationship anymore? Or does it just add kind of more layers of complexity, issues of class, issues of gender, and so something that I'm much more interested in addition to ethnicity and immigration, is also just questions of class and, as I had mentioned, being one of the newbie gentrifiers of West Oakland, right? I say that as a joke, but I really do feel like I have to be very conscious of that. So many, many more layers, right? Just on top of the where are you from and where are you really from. Yeah.
Speaking of where are you really from, and the kind of poetry that you write, you had indicated some of it is depressing, some of it is violent. What kind of feedback have you gotten from the Filipino community in terms of labels like feminist or Pinay or West Coast?
Yeah, definitely West Coast, definitely like Bay Area. But I've also had other Pinays say to me that the work is too painful. This is very, very painful to read. I can't engage it. This is too academic because you come from an academic program. And so I think that maybe those are just ways of people trying to find distance between themselves and a work that is very emotionally intense for them because it is resonating, I'm thinking. Yeah, so I think a lot of it is that, just finding the distance. Yeah, I think the work is, for me, always going to have to be truthful like that. I was told that, you know, when you're presenting work like this, especially to students, you have to be able to give them a glimmer of hope at the end. And I think that's a beautiful thing, but what if when you're writing about, you know, I was saying I'm writing about Filipinas on the internet right now. You know, sure, there are glimmers of hope, but if I start to, you know, kind of, okay, every 5 pages I'm going to put something positive here, right? I feel like that's, well, number one, it'll become cliche, and number two, it'll also be dishonest, right? Yeah, so I think a lot of it is that your work is painful, your work is, it's, you know, full of colonial pain. Like, well, you know, life is kind of a colonial pain, you know, so that's what I'm writing about. It has to be written about.
So in a lot of work you also explore Filipino mythology or ancestral stories.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you can talk about how that kind of, you know, myth making has influenced your work, both in terms of content as well as in terms of form, such as, you know, chanting or oral storytelling.
Yes. I started writing in these, you know, in like the myth-making mode, because I feel more comfortable doing that than actually revealing a lot about my personal I, right? So when I'm writing about all these different personas, you know, it's things that I'm thinking and maybe things that are hitting home very, very deeply for me, but it's really hard to be that vulnerable. And so to kind of cast it into this, you know, mythological space and give my persona, you know, to give my speakers a persona that's somebody other than myself has become very liberating. You know, it allows me to actually, like, you know, write a lot of the stuff that I would otherwise just never put down on paper. The chanting I love. I really love it because that's a form that I feel like, you know, I mean, the Beats did it and are known for it, and it's like, let's just take that back too. Not to say that anybody else is not allowed to do that, except that, you know, you know, it's something that I just, you know, it's very appealing to me, and I feel like, you know, every time you hit the refrain again, you're building upon everything that you've said in the previous lines, and so it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger the more, you know, the more you write this thing. Yeah, and I love the music of it. Reminds me of church, which is somewhere that I haven't gone in decades, and so, you know, in that way, it kind of hits a, you know, a place that's possibly spiritual, right? Possibly sacred. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about language? Especially, you talked about colonization, and you know, the Philippines has a very complicated colonial history, and I think also too, you mentioned, you know, the awkwardness, you know, tongue in cheek, the awkwardness of being Pinay published by a Latino Chicano press, and you know, just, I guess it just makes me think about language and all those intersections, and how complex it is, and maybe how that, I don't know, kind of works its way into your writing.
Yeah, I like going to non-English, you know, when I'm writing. One thing that I had said about the work that I'm currently writing is that somehow I want to be able to decenter English, but that's very hard when that's the primary language in which I'm literate and literary. So is there any way to be able to write a work or a body of work in which English is only part of, and not kind of the main space hog, right, of the work? I don't know how to do that yet, so I'm definitely trying. Spanish I go to a lot because of its familiarity, right? We know that in Tagalog there is a lot of, in modern Tagalog there's a lot of Spanish, and I'm intrigued at how the definitions of words change from Spanish to Filipino, Hispanized Filipino words or Tagalogized Spanish words, or even just among different Latin cultures. And so I've been having a really good time with that. So it's like, let's play with language. You know, there has to be a playful element to this as well. You know, and especially as I'm taking on these oral forms and the chanting, I'm loving the rhyming. I've been, you know, how do you do like what Notorious B.I.G. did, but in multiple languages in which English is decentered, you know, and you're having fun with it, and it isn't all just about, you know, pain and suffering, you know. So yeah, it's been nice to be able to do that, and you know, in my own family, we are a Filipino Latino family now, and so that's our mode of communication.
Yeah. Speaking of language, your poetics, could you say something about what poetic forms or non-formalist forms that you gravitate to or find yourself being repelled by or attracted to?
Okay. You know, I wanted to write a series of Tanaga, right? So that's a pre-colonial Tagalog form, 4 lines, 7 syllables per line, and then like a regular rhyme scheme, although I'm not exactly clear on what that rhyme scheme is, whether it's A, or, you know, just something that's recognizable, I'm guessing. But as I was writing my first few Tanaga, I realized that kind of became a tool for me to go back to these longer lines in the chant, right? And work with the internal rhymes in these longer lines. So I think that's part of how I've been using form, right, as a specific writing and drafting device. When I was writing one poem in Poeta in San Francisco, The Siren Story, I started by writing it in Hainaku, actually. And that made me like eliminate a lot of tiny little words that would otherwise take up a ton of space. And then once I was done with that, compressing it back into these longer lines ended up, you know, I ended up really liking that effect. It was really, really dense. So in that way, yeah, I like using form that way. In terms of what actually ends up in the finished, you know, in the finished work, I don't know that you actually see, you know, any actual like traditional forms, right? And I use them a lot just as exercise. I don't know. In terms of forms I'm repelled by, I don't know that I'm necessarily repelled by any forms. Sometimes it's a form that's just really, really hard, you know, that I want to try it. Like I have never been able to write a sestina, for example. I could try, or I could just kind of go, okay, well, you know, we'll just put that one aside. There's a bunch of other forms from a bunch of other places. And
like villanelles.
Like
Let's
villanelles.
put that aside.
Yes, exactly. Sestinas and villanelles are over there somewhere. Far away over there. But you know, I like the guzzle again for the repetition. It's kind of like, you know, the litany looks like this, and then the guzzle, the repetition is, you know, at the back end of the line instead. I like doing that as well. Just basically something that gives me a lot of opportunity to make repetition happen. Then can we also look at the kind of 4-beat line in hip hop as a form? Because you know, maybe Tanaga, the Tanaga that I write, if I actually manage to keep them in Tanaga, maybe they'll resemble more of these kind of, you know, hip hop rhymes instead. Like that, oh God, that woman who wrote those Mother Goose in the Hood poems. Like, I cannot remember her name, but you know what I'm talking about, right? You know, it has that really rhymey, sing-songy, but it's about, you know, rats and eviction and stuff. Amazing. Yeah. But yeah, the villanelles are
Awesome. So maybe for the last question.
Okay, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you feel has been your development as a poet, from Gravity's Center to Poets in San Francisco to Diwata, and then perhaps a little bit about, you know, your upcoming book and your new work.
Okay. Oh my God, that's a big question. Yeah, you know what? I learned a very useful word to describe my first book, and that is juvenilia, right? The work of the young, right? This is your work as a young person. These are the things you're concerned about as a young person. Gravity's Center had a lot of like heartbreak and punk rock. I feel like those are the kinds of themes that kind of drive the book. And I was telling Amalia, I was telling you the story of that piece of artwork on the front of, you know, the embracing skeletons. That's definitely heartbreaking punk rock, right? You know, and then from there I was like, okay, let's pick out the things that are kind of, you know, that I want to take with me into the next work, and a lot of it really did kind of have to do with, you know, Philippine history and colonization, and again, place, right? San Francisco as this site of violent collisions of human bodies, and you know, and so I think maybe the common theme that keeps happening does have to do with bodies, and I'm kind of learning more and more how to write about those bodies, rather than kind of wrap it up neatly in a book and say, okay, I'm done with it. You know, I feel like I have to just kind of keep, you know, kind of, well, number one, keep up with the times, but also keep up with like how I'm processing the way I'm seeing these Pinay bodies, you know, being handled in the world. I feel like sometimes I want to say that I'm writing the same book over and over and over again, because that theme of Pinay bodies is always going to be there. And then another poet, Urayoan Noel, he said a mentor had told him, you know, that's what you do. You constantly write the same book over and over and over again, right? And for me, that becomes very important, because the invisibility and hypervisibility happening simultaneously with these Pinay bodies is just something that I want to understand more fully, right? And want to be able to write about in more kind of complex ways. And, you know, and to kind of take all of the kind of social baggage about the work being so painful and so full of colonial pain, and just kind of chuck that aside and go, you know, are you living in this world? What do you see? You know, do not tell me that you can just kind of put any of this aside and just be a transcendent being that has nothing to do with these bodies, right? So I feel like that's kind of what's happening. You know, that they're bodies and they need voices, right? And they need their narratives fleshed out, and they need their histories and their motivations to kind of be, you know, considered, right? And in order to do that, I couldn't just write from my own perspective. I had to kind of keep going to these other sources and to these other women and say, like, what are you writing about? What are you worried about? What do you dream about? What are you upset about? What are you scared of? And then just, again, that source material with those crazy, I said testimonios earlier, but I think the official word for it is relaciones with the Spanish explorers, and kind of, you know, so I'm kind of tripping back and forth in history about how little has actually changed, right? The medium changes and the language changes, but the theme remains the same. There are these Pinay bodies that are constantly like being stripped of voice and, you know, lowered in status, and you know, so that's kind of where I'm going with this book that's coming out by the end of the year. In terms of where I'm going next, you know, I just want to allow myself to play with language and chant and still kind of work with that same theme, and hopefully it's readable, but then that's always like, readable by whom, right? But I swear I do want every other line to not be in English. That's all there is to it, right? And just kind of have some kind of 50-50 relationship between, you know, this kind of high, you know, the high language and this so-called lower language, you know, and you know, it might be kind of stark and unreadable to some, but I'm kind of beyond caring about, you know, I'm really beyond caring about like what American Pope is going to think about it. I'd be like, fuck them, I don't need to answer to you, you know what I mean? See, and here I am already kind of anticipating that people are going to hate my work, but, you know, and I feel like, you know, that's also part of being out there, right? Having your work out there is like, you have to imagine that people are going to receive it somehow. And then you have to decide how you're going to deal with it. So, but I just want to write this thing, and I want to be able to write more after that. I have no idea how I'm going to do it, but it just feels real big right now. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much
Yeah,
for
thank you.
participating in the New Oceania
Yeah, this was
interview
fun.
series and for visiting our students and faculty at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. We're going to go to the beach now, so for all those who are listening, don't get jealous.